Welcome to AFSPA Talks, a production of the American Foreign Service Protective Association. Each week, we deliver informative health and wellness topics you want to know about, so be sure to subscribe to us on your favorite podcast channel. And if you have any questions about content discussed in this episode, ask them at AFSPA Live, our live Q&A session, streaming every last Thursday of the month at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on youtube.com/AFSPAcares. Now here's your host, Chief Operating Officer Kyle Longton.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of AFSPA Talks. I'm your host, Kyle Longton, and with me once again is Maddie Norton. Maddie, welcome back.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us again. We're recording this, and we're going to publish this later today on August 28th. And for many in the Washington metro region, it is back to school. First day back to school. Some went back last week, but I know in my household it was today. It makes me very glad that I'm not going back to school.
Same.
But I think those are somewhat more recent memories for you than they are for me.
Yeah.
I mean, back to school is always like, going shopping for school supplies, going shopping for new shoes, and
clothes.
See, I was in uniforms from like third grade on, so it was like limited options in terms of what we could wear. Yeah. So, and in high school, no shorts, so it wasn't even
Interesting.
Yeah. And we had to make sure our socks covered our ankles. Apparently, that was a big deal.
Not the ankles.
No. So, but I do remember, getting. So my time in school predates Facebook. I'll just put that out there. So I remember getting teacher and class assignments, and we would just light up the phone lines. I'm guessing that you maybe were connecting with people in a slightly different way to share that information.
We would post to Instagram, I think, or Facebook, and be like, "This is my class schedule," and people would come and be like, "Oh, I have the exact same one," because it was a small school. So, like, if you had one person in your class, you had everybody.
In high school, at least, I won't touch on college, but in high school, like, I was in the marching band, just in case you're wondering how cool I was. And it was cool. I want to be clear about that. But we'd been together for 6 or 8 weeks at that point before school started, because we'd had all day band camp for weeks and then practices after that. So it was sort of anticlimactic, and I'd already seen most of my close friends and so forth, but it was still fun. I don't really remember, like, at least from high school, a lot of feelings of like anxiety or stress or anything coming back to school. It was sort of a happy time, but getting back into a schedule was maybe a little difficult after the summer.
Yeah, I would say my entire household was going to school. Both my parents were teachers. Yeah, so like when they went back to school, we went back to school as well. So it was, my household definitely was tense, maybe very anxious for new classes. And then of course, like, my parents were like, what kind of kids am I getting? And, how's this school year gonna go? But I think I was also just a very anxious child. So I always had to make sure everything was in order. And everything was prepared.
You've seen my office, so that's not really me. This behind me is real, but it is also set up for the camera. Well, I will say, I think for my parents, they were very glad when my sister, who's a couple of years older, and then when we were able to drive, because we would have to catch the bus in middle and high school before 6 a.m. It would take us to a bus compound. We'd switch buses and then go on to our school. Unusual district in many ways, not a homeschool. It was straight out. It was a half-hour drive to my school.
Oh my gosh.
But I know that my mom was very glad when she didn't have to get up and make sure we were at the bus stop on time. But
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think
transferring buses before you even were on the metro,
Yeah, or getting out and slipping on the ice at the bus compound, and not that I did that twice, but no, of course not. But I will say, with my kids going back to school, and today my daughters went back, and my son goes tomorrow. There is some anxiousness about new classes, and they know all the people in their grade, but it's a new mix, and of course a new teacher, and will I get used to the teacher? Will they like me? And so there is some of that, and it's a challenge to sort of manage it. And I'm grateful that, at least my kids are going to the same school
Yeah.
this year that they went to last year. It's a 20-minute walk from my house if we needed to
Nice.
get there. Yeah. Very different from my own
Yeah,
experience.
very different. Very different.
But I know, we hear from members every day, and we actually go out and meet them where they are, who are having a very different experience. They're going to school, not just a new school, but a new country, a new city, and so forth. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So as I said earlier, it's back to school day for my kids. And I'm grateful that they're nearby, that they're going to the same school they went to last year. They know people, but for many of our members, and we hear this from them when they call us or write to us, or even when we go out and visit them, that's not the case for many of them. Often they are starting school in a new city, a new country, on a new continent, and often that comes with new expectations, changed curricula, and things like that. And there are bigger challenges that come along with that. And I'm grateful today that we have someone who can sort of talk us through not just the basics that maybe a family like mine is facing, but also that our foreign service families may be facing around the world. And so we're privileged to have Jodi Harris with us. Jodi is a licensed clinical social worker who works with adults, couples, parents, preteens, and teens who are struggling with anxiety, depression, adjustment to life transitions, stress, health issues, and other challenges. She has a particular interest and skill set in supporting people living or working across cultures, including immigrant and migrant communities, individuals seeking refuge from community violence, expats, foreign service, military, and third culture kids and their families. She also has direct experience with and special interest in working with families affected by type 1 diabetes. Her approach to therapy is open, authentic, nurturing, creative, and collaborative. She works with clients to foster resilience, cultivate mindful awareness, see things anew, and live in tune with their values and the vision of who they most want to be in the world. Her work draws upon a variety of perspectives, including acceptance and commitment therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and motivational interviewing. A native of Austin, Texas, Jodi has spent 15 years of her adult life living overseas in 7 countries across 4 continents. She has BAs in English and Spanish from the University of Texas at Austin, and after a time teaching high school and working in community health, she received her Master's of Social Work from University of Texas at Austin, with a focus in social work, international social work, and conflict resolution. She's also a trained ICF accredited life coach and a certified mindfulness teacher. She's bilingual in English and Spanish. She and her spouse of 20 years have 3 children, and she's going to bring not only her clinical and her professional perspective, but also her parental perspective to us today. So I am grateful. And Jodi, welcome to AFSPA Talks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kyle. I'm so happy to be here and really looking forward to the conversation today.
Me too. And I mentioned, we talked a little bit before. I think your kids are back in school. Mine just started back today. In fact, my youngest doesn't start pre-K until tomorrow. So I'm going to do my best to keep this conversation general and not specific to my needs as a parent. So not a personal session for me, but we do have listeners with children of all ages, and I understand that development needs are going to vary by age, and I see this. Just my oldest are only 7, and I've seen this change over time. So as a place to start for our listeners and in this conversation, are there specific things that you recommend for parents to do to help their children start the school year well when we're thinking about mental wellness?
Right. Yeah, such a great question and a great place to start. Regardless of the developmental age, the most important thing that parents can do is to connect with their child. And already you probably, as a parent, have kind of the way that you connect with your older children, with your middle-aged children, and with your younger children based on their needs and where they are developmentally, and even their individual personalities, right? Even in my own family, we have one of my children is extremely outgoing, one is more shy, and one is kind of in the middle. And each of them needs something different at the beginning of the school year. So as a parent, just thinking how you normally connect with your child. And even though the school year can kind of throw things into a bit of disarray, remembering that that is still important, those unique needs of your child. And so, for younger kids, that can mean thinking about what are the routines you have around bedtime, dinner time? Maybe homework isn't as big of an issue in elementary school, but those routines and those boundaries remain important to your child even as the school year starts. And all children, all people really crave structure and routines, but younger kids feel the effects of that even more. So kind of keeping up with those sorts of things. And then with your older kids, oh my gosh, I have a high school senior. Like, I just can't believe it. And, it's like, it can feel like there are fewer and fewer opportunities to really connect. And yet they need that time with you during this kind of big transition, whether it's into high school or out of high school, just as much as they did when they were younger. And it very well might look different. At Active and Connected, the therapy practice where I work, we're like huge components of special time. And that's that 10 to 15 minutes that you can have each day or a couple times a week with your child. And so with a kindergartner, it might mean, okay, every night after bath for 15 minutes, we do 15 minutes of Legos, and then we clean up and we go to bed, or reading, or whatever it is. But for your older child, that can be something like, hey, Saturday afternoon, you don't have anything, I don't have anything. Do you want to go to Starbucks with me and we just grab a coffee? And that sort of thing is incredibly important, because even if you're not talking about something big, they know that they have that special time with you. And it's, a really great opportunity to maintain that connection with them.
Yeah, we started doing that in my house last year, where we've got, mommy daughter time, daddy son time, daddy daughter time, etc. And it's maybe just going to the smoothie shop here in our town, or up to the public library, or we're big fans of board games in my house, so we play a lot of Clue at this age, or Monopoly Junior, even though my daughters cheat. But we do a lot of that.
Right.
So,
right.
And you touched on this, that back to school time can be a time for a lot of changes for children and families, getting back to a routine, maybe new schools, depending on the age. Are there certain signs that parents can look for that may help us distinguish between just adjustment to these changes and maybe signs of something that requires a bit more attention and support, something like depression or anxiety or adjustment disorder?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right that some of these changes we see in kids are absolutely normal, right? And many of them we can attribute to, like, oh man, the start of the school year has been really rough, and not just for kids, right? But for parents, you suddenly are reevaluating like who gets who where, and there's just like this big uptick in stress. And certainly for foreign service families, you're often also arriving at post. So it's just super complicated. But there are things that as a parent are really important to keep an eye on. So any sort of kind of behavioral changes that seem out of character for your child or don't seem developmentally appropriate, to fighting, increased arguing, not engaging in schoolwork, and those things can just be a sign of transition, right? But if they seem particularly out of character, it's just enough to kind of like, I always tell people, it's just like a sticky note, like, that's interesting, something I want to keep an eye on. Changes certainly in things like self-care, eating more or less, not being able to shower or continue with their regular routines, not being able to keep their room clean, and not just messy, but, like an inability to wash their clothes or to keep up with their chores that lasts more than a couple weeks. Like, it's one thing if you're just kind of off your schedule. It's another thing if you are really not able to get out of bed, or you're not able to get to school, or, to kind of complete those daily tasks. Of course, changes in mood, right? If your child seems depressed or anxious or down, or, as a parent, a lot of that is just kind of paying attention to kind of your own gut feeling. And it's no different than kind of the experience you have when you have an infant. And sometimes you're like, I don't know, they just seem kind of fussy, right? No, they don't have a fever, a tummy ache, but something seems unusual. And you take them to the doctor. And the same thing is with mental health. Like, they just seem a little off, right? So you might notice those changes in mood in a way that's not really concrete, but you're like, something seems different here. another thing I like to talk about, and I think, this is true for all kids, but I feel like it's especially true for, kind of the foreign service community, is the trouble in recovering from setbacks, right? Like, it's hard to move and change friends, right? Or, even for kids that don't move, it's difficult if you don't pass an exam, or you try out for a sports team or a play and you don't get a role. But if that seems to be something that you can't recover from, and weeks are passing and there's kind of a rumination on that, or those things tend to escalate into other concerns, that's something as well as a parent. Maybe your child needs a little bit of support with that. And then, of course, if you see your child isolating themselves, if they're, stepping back from the family or from friendships, those are things to kind of, keep an eye on as well. In older kids, but certainly, you know, I say older kids, I think of high school, but then sometimes this is something that can happen in middle school. You realize that they're using drugs or alcohol or experimenting. And the same with things of, if you are concerned about self-harm, or you're concerned, maybe they say something to you that makes you think that maybe they've thought of suicide. And of course, now we're getting kind of further down the line of things to keep an eye on, but
Yeah.
anything like that is a sign that your child needs additional support.
Okay. Well, and I mean, I appreciate sort of the insight about ages, and that parents should be looking this at maybe younger ages than we might anticipate when we're talking about some of these activities that they may be engaging in or experimenting with. And I'm just wondering, related to that, are there certain ages or milestones at which there may be a need for more support, and what might that support look like, or what might those signs look like if it's moving into middle school, if it's moving into high school, or taking on additional challenges? What are we looking for there?
Right, right. So certainly with kids, there's kind of these standard life transitions that all people go through, right? So starting kindergarten, um, that kind of transition to middle school, so fourth, fifth, sixth grade, right? So maybe you're not exactly starting middle school, but I work with a lot of fourth, fifth, and sixth graders. And we probably all remember, like, that's a really hard time. There's a lot that happens and changes in your body and changes in your identity and trying to figure things out. And then, of course, transition to high school, and the transitions that happen during puberty and your connections to yourself and understanding yourself. And then certainly transition into college or into whatever you have planned after high school. And so, those things happen. And then on top of that, often kids are, or they may find themselves in situations where the parents are divorcing or separating, or there's a big move, or there's a new baby. Maybe a sibling is going off to college and they feel that sense of isolation, that maybe they're the only child left at home. And so some of those things that I mentioned, they can really show up in any age. They might look slightly different, right? Like isolation in a 5-year-old might look different than isolation in a 17-year-old. In fact, likely will, because a 5-year-old still needs you to like help them with their bath and brushing their teeth and getting dinner, right? They're less likely to just be in their room and slam the door and to tell you to leave them alone, right? But you might just notice a kind of, I am inclined to do it physically, but it's just a kind of turning in, right? And you notice they seem quieter, they seem less responsive, they seem more kind of in their head. And it doesn't mean anything's wrong in a kind of clinical sense, but it could mean that there's a sign that they're struggling. And if some of these big transitions or life milestones are happening, then it's likely that, that combined with some of those behavioral changes means that maybe it's rougher for them than you anticipated. Yeah. And I think you had asked kind of like what might support look like, right? In terms of helping kids through those
Right.
transitions. So, one thing is just the kind of support that we offer as parents, right? To connect with our children, to validate their feelings. It's so tempting. And it's funny, I joke a lot sometimes when I'm working with a lot of parents that kind of fall into like my age category, and we think about our own parents who might say things like, "Oh, stop crying." And then, and we're in this battle of ourselves where we're like, I know I'm not supposed to say that anymore, but I'm also not really sure
Right.
what to say to my kid, right? And so, validating your child's anger or sadness, is a huge benefit to children. So recognizing like you're sad and you're crying, we all feel sad sometimes. It's okay to feel sad, right? And that doesn't mean you don't set boundaries, right? You feel sad because I said you couldn't have ice cream for breakfast. I get it, right? We're going to choose something else. And I'm sorry. Yeah. And you're sad, right? Both things can be true. And then, also getting help from the school. So teachers, coaches, counselors, school psychologists, if it looks like maybe there needs to be some testing done, perhaps if a child is suffering from like a learning challenge or needs some adaptations to their workload based on, maybe things that are showing up academically or interpersonally. And then ultimately, maybe getting the support of a therapist who specializes either in the specific needs of your child or can even work with the family. And sometimes that's the case, that parents also need the support to figure out how do I help my kid in this situation, because we're not experts, all of us. We're not geniuses, right? And even as a parent and a therapist, right, there are things where I'm like, gosh, I'm kind of stuck here with my own kid. I'm not really sure what to do. So it's knowing when to get that help.
That makes me feel a little bit better. That well, and I wonder, I want to dive a little bit deeper into your own experience, both personally and particularly professionally, in working with populations who are overseas, the foreign, particular interest to us for the foreign service community. But I wonder, before we get there, are there any general resources you might share with our listeners that they might turn to as they're trying to help their kids?
Yeah. So, every family is different in terms of their kind of parenting philosophy or their perspective. And those things I wanted to kind of acknowledge. There are differences in terms of, linguistic differences, cultural differences, age differences, that, or even, religious differences that affect people's perspective on how they're parenting, right? And so, but there are some things, of course, that are universal. And that's learning how to connect with your child, how to validate their feelings while simultaneously establishing, boundaries and rules and consequences when children are not able to, do the things that they're supposed to do. There's some resources that I personally really love as a parent and as a therapist. There's a psychologist, Becky Kennedy. She has a book called Good Inside. I love that book. I really find that it has really great ideas for how parents can support their children in a way that promotes emotional wellness and mental health. The other book that's been around a really long, that book is newer. Another book that's been around now forever, geez, probably 20 years, The Whole Brain Child by Dr. Dan Siegel. He's also a child psychologist. Really, similarly talks about how to promote kind of an awareness of emotions in your child and to teach your child how to express their emotions in ways that are healthy. And then kind of practically, and another book that I love for foreign service families is Third Culture Kids Growing Up Among Worlds. And I think of that as like the TCK Bible, if you will. I think all foreign service parents should be reading that just to kind of understand what it means to be a third culture kid and what it means to grow up, kind of between your passport country and the country you live in and moving around. And then some kind of practical resources that I really like. The Foreign Service Youth Foundation often does kind of educational opportunities. We've done a few things with them, but also they just are so well connected with the foreign service community. They offer really great, services to their members. And then the practice that I work with, that Active and Connected Family Therapy, we have a podcast. And our practice owner, Dr. Amanda Sobek Johnston, does some really great stuff on parenting and working with kids. She's really an expert. So I always recommend her podcast. I like it.
Absolutely. And we'll post some links to those resources in the show notes for our listeners.
Mhm.
And actually, Jodi, that provides, I think, a fantastic segue to talk a little bit more about your practice and the work that you do, because many of our members and our listeners reside overseas, and they are attached either to military bases or to the U.S. diplomatic missions around the world.
Yeah.
And a lot of them, and many of them, it sounds like they're not there alone. They have their families with them in many of these locations. And so this time of the year, their kids are not just starting a new school year, but maybe starting a new school in a new country that could be incredibly different from their past academic experiences. So I'm wondering if you can just share a little bit with us about your experience, and how you and your colleagues approach care for the overseas population.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Active and Connected Family Therapy was founded in Charlottesville about 10 years ago. And then a couple years ago, a Foreign Service spouse, Pat Ryan, who's also a clinical social worker, he opened up a small office of the practice in Falls Church. And because of his understanding of the Foreign Service community, started getting a few Foreign Service clients. I came on board about a year and a half ago, and of course, also, connected with the Foreign Service. And we had some really, long conversations about what about our clients that we're seeing in our Falls Church or our office in Arlington, that we're seeing them and then they go back overseas, right? It just was so hard to know that, and we know from personal
Mhm.
experience as well, like you're working with someone and then it's like, good luck. And so we started exploring initially, like, how can we continue to see adult clients that we've been seeing up here, right? So people we had already been working with, we knew about them. And so about a year ago, we started kind of a trial of like, okay, how can we keep seeing adult clients that we've seen here when they go back overseas? And then we expanded that a little bit to, okay, how do we then work with Foreign Service clients who are attached to a US mission overseas? We work with people that are under Chief of Mission Authority. We want them to have access to the med unit, to the RMOPs if need be. How do we see some adults who are already overseas? Maybe we never saw them in person here, but they happen to be somewhere overseas that they need services. So we expanded to that. We added a couple people to our team. And then just in the spring, we started collaborating and having conversations with Med about the possibility of beginning to see some children. We do that on a case-by-case basis. There are times where we have someone on our team who can do assessments of kind of some of the risks that might be in a child being or not being at post, and what might be some recommendations there. And so we now have a team. Pat has actually moved on. He's going back overseas and is transitioning into other work. But we now have a team of 3 clinical social workers combined between us. I think we have 60 years experience. And then we have a psychologist on our team. So really robust experience of Foreign Service military spouses who are working with adults and some children. And we're able to take people, we have space, and then eventually we'll probably add more people to the team once we get full.
Okay, but just to clarify for our listeners, again, focused on those who are under Chief of Mission Authority, adults primarily, but on a case-by-case basis, there are some children who are part of your practice. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay, good.
That's right. Yeah.
But it sounds like, given all of this and given your own experience and even the one of the resources you just referenced, you've got a good knowledge and can share some good things with us about sort of the new term for me, honestly, the third culture kids, and what it's like for them starting in a new starting school in a new country.
Yeah, right. I mean, so this is where I'll share a little bit of my own personal story. So when we went overseas in our first tour, my oldest was 3, and my son, who's now my middle son, was 1. My daughter wasn't even born yet. And I read this, my husband and I grew up like, regular people, like living in one place more or less,
Not
right?
traveling every few years.
Not traveling every few years,
moving
right?
house, yeah.
And so, as a I was already a clinical social worker. I had been working with adolescents, and I had even done some international social work. I had in graduate school, but I really was like, okay, what can we understand about how this experience will be unique for our kids, because we ourselves hadn't had that experience. And I really started with reading the book Third Culture Kids. And Ruth Van Rinken, who is one of the co-authors, is the founder of Families in Global Transition, which, full disclosure, I've been vice president on the board for 4 years of Families in Global Transition. But that organization really, focuses on, and then the kind of concept of third culture kids as well is really based around, like, there is this group of people that live not in their passport country. And at the same time, they're overseas in a way that does not always enable them to immerse themselves in the other culture, right? Like maybe they don't even fully learn the language or adopt the customs, or, they're living in a country where nobody celebrates, Christmas, for example, but they celebrate Christmas. And so, one of the things that we see is that there's this, so one concept that is used within within psychology and within mental health is the what we call the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, right?
Yeah.
And that can be moves, divorce, job loss, illness of a child or parent, right? There are some very specific categories that they use for research, but in general, it's like things that happen in your childhood that can have a negative impact on you. And within this community, within the Foreign Service and for third culture kids, that those experiences are really kind of ingrained into the lifestyle, right? And while that doesn't mean kids who grew up in the Foreign Service are guaranteed to suffer and their lives will be problematic, it does mean as parents and as mental health providers, we have a really huge responsibility to help reduce the negative impact of those moves, of the loss, of those changes in friendship, and to really be listening to our children and helping them put words to those experiences, right? And so when my kids were little, that meant doing things like, I remember we were going to a family reunion. This is when we were in Madagascar. So my kids must have been like 7, 4, and infant. And we put up a family tree with photos on the wall of their playroom because we realized they don't even know their cousins.
Mm-hmm.
Like they met them a year ago, but a year is a long time when you're that age, right?
Yeah.
So helping them kind of really understand who they are, where is home for them, who their support systems are, and teaching them the language they need to kind of express that sense of distance, that sense of loss, that sense of transition. And if we start that early, then that continues into their middle years and their teen years and really off into college, right? Because it's not that it won't be hard, it will be hard. And we can acknowledge that it will be hard at times, but we can help them provide the language to integrate that into their life story in a way that gives them the tools they need once they're out on their own.
Okay. And I want to ask, and this may be the same answer, and it may seem like the same question, but I'm wondering, are there specific considerations for children who may have spent much of their childhood and really their educational experience outside the U.S. and who are returning to the U.S. and starting school, maybe starting high school or coming in the middle of high school for the first time? That's their first experience really in the U.S. Is that a different answer, I guess?
Yeah, right. There's some things that are the same, right? Because a move is a move and a transition is a transition. But some of the things that might be different is that you're expected to know things about the United States, to know things about American culture, that even if you're growing up in a kind of quote unquote American household overseas, you still may have missed. So I just think about this past school year, which was essentially the first real time that my children were in American public school. Like we'd had some training periods or whatever, but so my kids were coming to school, they're 5th, 9th, and 11th grade, right? And so, my boys were like, "Have you heard of homecoming?" And I was like, yeah, definitely. They had no idea. I realized that they hadn't actually um, ever watched the Super Bowl. Like, they had a concept of it, but it just happened to be wherever we'd lived, we hadn't ever watched the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
And those were things like all the kids at school were talking about it. And then we realized that my daughter didn't know what to do. This is embarrassing. She didn't know what to do during the pledge. Like, they stood up and I'm like, whoa, we've been at embassies and stuff. But she was like, I didn't know what to do. And she came home the first day last year. And that can create that sense of feeling left out or misunderstood. The truth is that all kids from time to time feel left out or misunderstood. But it's certainly, you imagine a lot of our families are coming back to big Northern Virginia, big Maryland schools, and it just can feel like a lot at once. And it can create that sense of, not understanding the way things work. And that can be a learning curve.
Okay. And I guess just as we get close to wrapping up, based on your experience working with kids and teens and families, do you have any general tips, whether general or even generally specific to the foreign service community, that you can share for promoting mental and behavioral wellness year round for everybody involved?
Yeah, right. I mean, more than anything, for parents to keep in mind with their kids is connect, connect, connect. How can you, sometimes it means like listening more than speaking, noticing that tendency to go into problem solving mode, which is normal and natural, but to really provide a space for your children to express their feelings, for them to have to be reassured that their feelings are normal, that they can be okay, that they can get help if they need it. Really normalizing mental health care, not just your children's mental health care, but your own mental health care, because this lifestyle is also hard for adults. And normalizing getting support for mental health needs is critical as well. And then creating, kind of an open, ongoing, age-appropriate dialogue with your kids about feelings, about healthy ways to express feelings, and then also modeling those behaviors yourself.
Okay, that's very good advice. And I appreciate it. But before we wrap up, is there anything else that you'd like to add? Anything you feel like maybe we missed today or want to hit again?
Yeah, no, not at all. Just the importance of, it can be hard as a parent to decide to move forward with getting mental health support for your child. And, sometimes children need to work with a therapist or families need to work with a therapist, but sometimes there's plenty of supports within the school system. And it can be scary for financial reasons to move forward. It can feel like, especially within the foreign service community, what's going to happen to our posting? We recognize all these things come up. But when in doubt, knowing that reaching out is important, and that it's important for people to think about how to continue to kind of integrate these supports into their lives. Everybody will need them at some point, or most people will.
Absolutely. And I so appreciate, focused on normalization and removing any stigma that we can around seeking mental health care, because it is healthcare, regardless of the age. So thank you very much for that reminder. And thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. It was a joy to speak with you and to share this with the community.
Thanks again. Thanks again to Jodi Harris from Active and Connected Family Therapy for joining us today. Jodi will also be our guest on Thursday, August 31st at 11 a.m. Eastern Time for AFSPA Live. She'll be there to answer questions you may have about back-to-school mental wellness and other topics. Please join us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or on YouTube. Search for @AFSPA Cares and be prepared to ask her questions or just listen to our dialogue on August 31st. This has been AFSPA Talks, a production of the American Foreign Service Protective Association. All information offered in this podcast is meant to be educational. The views expressed by the hosts and guests are their own and do not necessarily represent AFSPA. Should there be any discrepancy between information offered in this podcast and official plan documents for the Foreign Service Benefit Plan or other products offered by AFSPA, the policy provisions will prevail. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe to AFSPA Talks to catch our next episode. Please rate and review us on your favorite podcast app, and share feedback with us on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. Talk again soon.
Thanks for joining us this week on AFSPA Talks. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you'll never miss an episode. If you have any follow-up questions about the topics in this episode, join our AFSPA Live Q&A session on the last Thursday of every month. We will be streaming live on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/AFSPAcares at 11 a.m. Eastern Time to answer your questions. Thanks for listening.